Shalom, my name is Rabbi Tuchman, and it is an honor to be speaking with all of you as part of Limud North America's Global Day of Jewish Learning on the theme of Kavod HaBriot, human dignity. I will be speaking today about the personal relevance and resonance of what I believe to be our tradition's most foundational teaching in the work that I do, primarily around communal inclusion of Jews with disabilities and other marginalized identities. Kavod HaBriot, which we so frequently translate as human dignity, I believe can be translated in a variety of ways, including honoring Hashem's creations and honoring Hashem's creatures. Kavod comes from the Hebrew shorash, kaf vet dalid, meaning heavy, that there is a heaviness in importance when we honor others and ourselves. Human dignity asks and demands us to remember that every single person has inherent dignity and worth, and most importantly, a spark of the divine within. We are living in a world that is being shaped by national, global, personal, and interpersonal forces unlike anything we've ever experienced. And it is all the more important that we place Kavod HaBriot, or human dignity, at the center of the work that we do, and most importantly, at the center of the relationships that we have with each other, with our families, our communities, and everyone within our circle of care and concern. Kavod HaBriot is a foundational value for me in the work that I do around disability inclusion, because everything I do stems from the belief that we all have what to contribute to make our communities and our people stronger. The Torah in its fullest is revealed when all of us are able to bring our full selves to the work that we do and to the communities that we are a part of. Oftentimes, accessibility is sometimes thought about as a nice thing to do or something that we do for those who are outside of our community. But I'm interested in flipping that paradigm entirely and reminding us that this is not about those who are out there or other or away from us, but rather accessibility is fundamentally about who we are as a collective. We are part of this community and we would like to be able to fully participate. Too many Jews with disabilities and other marginalized identities have felt pushed away from Jewish life, which is a travesty and a tragedy that I work every day to alleviate. Kavod HaBriot is the fundamental idea that even when the work gets messy and the work gets hard and the work gets really contentious, we are in it for the long haul, because at the end of the day, the work that we are doing is about transforming ourselves and transforming society from the inside out. It's one of my teachers, Rabbi David Jaffe, reminds us all the time. The work of social transformation and social change is work that begins with our own selves and our own souls, and the work that we each need to do. Though I am very versed in the work of disability inclusion, and I have been for the better part of a decade, through my own lived experience, as well as the lived experiences of those with whom I am privileged to be in relationship, as well as colleagues, friends, mentors, teachers, and those whose views are different from my own. I had a lot of growing that I needed to do and continue to need to do to become the best self that I can be and to be able to do the work in the best way that I can. Kavod HaBriot is that foundational value that I return to over and over again when I notice feelings of resentment emerging. This work is too hard. How am I supposed to raise the money to provide XYZ accommodation? Or how many people really need this accommodation? When I get into that mind spiral, which I know too well as someone who is part of a very low incidence group, and what that means is that there aren't so many blind people in the world, it's easy to get into the mindset of, this is going to cost too much money, there aren't enough people, why am I spending my resources in this way? When I get into that space, I have to remember, again, This is not a numbers game. This is about neshamas. This is about people's souls. This is about creating spaces of sanctuary for all of us. And there is certainly no doubt that the resources are tight, budgets even tighter in this world in which we are all experiencing so much contraction. And amidst that contraction, it is all the more important to remind ourselves and to live out our tradition's most foundational idea that we all are created b'tselem Elokim, as we learn in Genesis 1:27, which we read very recently in our Torah reading cycle. A few examples of the way in which I have tried to live this value out in the work that I do are in how I have worked to train leaders in synagogues, in community spaces, in seminary contexts, to think differently about inclusion. That it's not about a top-down approach, or it's not about us saying, we are insiders, you are outsiders, let us widen our tent to bring you in, but rather saying, we are all part of a collective together. How can we continually open that circle so that there is more and more room for more and more approaches to emerge? How much stronger are we when we lean into our creativity, when we lean into our out-of-the-box thinking, and allow for the various ways in which people see the world to play a pivotal role in how we shape our communities and how we interact with our tradition? Kavod HaBriot instructs us to remember that those ways of seeing the world, those life experiences, those differences are so important, not ancillary, not unfortunate, but part of the blueprint of how this world is and how we ought to appreciate it. Too often, understandings that disability communities bring to the table are not seen as culturally significant. They're not seen as culturally significant because the assumption is I have the dominant way of doing something. I am a sighted, hearing, ambulatory person, and therefore I have the dominant way, and the world is constructed in a way that allows for my mobility to be pretty unimpeded. And so if you happen to be someone who is not an ambulatory person, may use a wheelchair, or is blind, or is deaf, or any number of other human differences that are natural parts of the human condition, we're seen as somehow outside of that scope. But I don't believe that that's how Hashem ever instructed or ever wanted the world to be created, in such a way that one particular population would be seen as normative and the rest of us marginal, trying as hard as we can to either fit into a structure or create a structure that better allows us to thrive. If I want to work in this world of so many different communities with so many different needs, I have to constantly remember that that norm, which in some ways privileges me and in some ways definitely does not, ultimately hurts all of our ability to thrive as the full selves that we are. And remembering that that dignity, that human dignity that we all have is inherent, is something that allows me to show up in those moments when the work is really hard, or in those moments when I might be having a pastoral meeting, or I might be having a logistical meeting, or any number of challenging circumstances. When I start to feel myself go into a spiral of resentment or frustration, or why do I have to work this way, or any number of those things, I am reminded and commanded and required to return again and again to the foundational root of everything I do, the centrality of Kavod HaBriot. Accessibility is not about doing the nice thing. It's not about doing the right thing either, even though accessibility is certainly the right thing to do. Accessibility fundamentally, I believe, as a religious person, as an observant person, is about living out Torah's commandments, that we are to be a kingdom of priests and holy nation, that we are to be a light unto the nations, that we are to be symbolic exemplars of what a redeemed world can look like, even and especially during times of crisis, contraction, and constriction. Kavod HaBriot also underlines the ways in which I try to navigate the various ways in which people approach disability inclusion. I am fundamentally of the belief that people with disabilities and other marginalized identities are as diverse as anyone else, and that therefore communities of all sorts in the Jewish world and beyond are part of this work. This is not only owned by one part of the Jewish community or another part of the Jewish community, but actually this is something that we are all, or ought to be all, deeply invested in. And one of the greatest joys of the work is the fact that were I not in this work, I probably would not have the relationships with many of the individuals that I have relationships with, who practice differently than I do, who daven differently than I do, who think about halakha, Jewish law, differently than I do, who think about any number of things differently than I do, but with whom I'm able to build those really strong foundational bonds around the centrality that we all place on kavod habriot, on valuing each and every single person in our community. Self-determination is another key component of kavod habriot from my perspective. Self-determination is fundamentally the idea that in secular disability settings is often referred to as this notion that we believe that people have the right and ought to have the ability to make determinations about the course of their lives. This is particularly potent and important for those who are in institutional settings or long-term care settings where there are a lot of constraints on a person's ability to make their own schedule, for example, choose their own food, choose their own bedtime, any number of those things that so many of us take entirely for granted. And in a spiritual way, it also is the notion that just as we all have our own paths, we all have our own maslul within the larger tradition, and that is as true of people who might identify as having a disability or other marginalized identity as it would be for anyone else. You'll notice that I keep on using the term Jews with disabilities. That is a term that I am defaulting to, though it is not the term that everybody uses. It is often, though, the most accurate term to use, especially when we are trying to make larger statements about a very diverse community. So because we don't have a better catch-all, I'm going to continue to use this term, but recognize that there are many other terms that people use, including using terms that are known as identity first. So for example, if I were to use identity first language, which is my personal preference, I would say I'm a blind woman, as opposed to saying I'm a woman who is blind. Because just as I would not say I am a woman who is Jewish, I would say I am a Jewish woman. I wouldn't say I am a woman who is blind. It is an idea that just as my Jewishness is fundamental to every aspect of my identity and my life and how I think of myself and how I physically show up in the world, and it is every part of who I am as a human being from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed, so too are so many other aspects of our identity, including for many identities around disability or other marginalized identity. Kavod habriot is a value that I return to again and again and again because it is such an important value that we do not live out well in this world. If it were easy, we wouldn't have to repeat it, we wouldn't have to explain it, we wouldn't have to explicate it. If it were easy, this would be a natural way to think about each other, but it is not, as we are seeing revealed again and again and again. I believe that it is extraordinarily important to lift this up in our educational institutions, in our interpersonal relationships, in our homes, in our families, everywhere we have influence. And it's not about talking the talk, it's about acting and showing up in the world as our best self, as living this value out. How do we live this value out? Part of it is allowing ourselves to be humble and know what it is we do not know. When I am faced with a situation in any of the inclusion work that I do that challenges me, which happens very often, one of the blessings of this work is that because the communities are so diverse, I am inevitably going to face challenges to my preconceived ideas. I am inevitably going to face challenges to my personal preferences on the language that I use, the terminology that I use, the way that I understand the experiences that I have. And I have two options in that moment. I can either shut down and build a wall even higher around my own self and protect myself against any other ways of thinking, or I can allow myself to stretch, to grow, to be challenged, and to be changed. And allowing for those challenges and changes to emerge stems again out of the idea that every single person, even those with whom, and especially those with whom I do not agree or maybe do not understand ideas in the same way, I have to always remember and live out the idea that we all have human dignity inherently. And rather than saying, why do you understand inclusion differently than I do? Or why would you use that term differently than I do? And that's a very common impulse. And I'm certainly not one who has not experienced that. I'm frequently experiencing those thoughts and I frequently have to check them. I instead can say, what is the life experience that you've had that has brought you here? Because I deeply believe that the way in which we understand ourselves and we understand the world is not simply an intellectual exercise. I don't believe that most of us come to the ways in which we understand the world and our political views, our religious views, our social views, our ways of being purely from the seichel, purely from the intellect, but really that all of this comes from our own life experiences. And I am humbly aware that I have evolved and I'm continuing to evolve and I'm continuing to shift and change. And that divine spark that's within me, that's within you, that's within all of us is constant, is unchanging, and it's an inalienable part of who every single one of us is. If this was a value that we truly lived out in the world, we would be seeing a very different world. But it is never, ever too late to begin to lift this up. As we learn in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers, we may not finish the work. We may not complete the work. We're never free to desist from it. I may not be conversant with all areas, but I am conversant with some, and so I am obligated to bring my talents to bear on those areas in which I have particular expertise, and then recognizing that it's not about me, but every single person I encounter has that human dignity inherently and has a divine spark. I want to allow the divine sparks in others to be revealed by lifting up their lived experience and by amplifying their voices. That's fundamentally the work that I try to do in the world. I try to be a connector and an amplifier and a convener, as well as a thought leader who tries utmost every day to not center my own view to the exclusion of others, but instead to lean into the blessings that come with working in a community that is extraordinarily diverse, extraordinarily messy, extraordinarily gifted. All of those things are true. And though sometimes the work is hard and challenging, ultimately there is so much blessing because we live out every day in the work that we do to make our communities more accessible, in the work that we do to make every space we inhabit more accessible. We are living out the tradition's fundamental call to all of us to value each and every human being for who they are in their totality, and accessibility allows that totality to be made manifest into the wider world. This then allows for Torah to be revealed in its fullness and its completeness, because we are able to bring all of us who thirst for Torah's life-giving waters into our sacred spaces, into our shiurim, our classes, our study sessions, our davening, our tefillot, our homes, our Shabbos celebrations, our Chag celebrations, because we want and value the diversity and beauty that comes when our communities reflect the depth and the breadth of who we are as Am Yisrael.